Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into another episode of Eyes on the Prize. Greg Mescall is the guest today, and this is for all of those Olympic fans out there, especially Greg, my good friend, broadcast for the Pac-12 Network, ESPN, Westwood One, and USA Water Polo, as well as a few other outlets, ESPN3, or I mentioned ESPN, but I wanted to talk the Olympics with him because he has been to Olympics, he's covered Olympics, he's broadcasted for Olympics, he knows Olympic athletes really well, works with them, and he knows what this means that there will be no Olympics in 2020. Pushing this back a year obviously affects the athletes, affects the brands involved, affects the people who work on the IOC side of things, on the USOC side of things, Team USA. So Greg gave some very interesting insight into that. We taped this earlier on in quarantine, earlier on in April, meant to be, he was, nice enough to tape this, meant to be evergreen. So now I am sharing it, the latest episode of Eyes on the Prize with Greg Mescall. Greg Mescall is now with me. I want to get all your credentials right. A broadcaster for the Pac-12 Network, ESPN, Westwood One, USA Water Polo, the Manhattan Jaspers. Also just deep in the water polo community, which is especially why I want to talk to you today. We talk about so many different things, but you are deep into the Olympics. And, this is such a weird time, something that when you sign up to be part of the Olympics, part of the Olympic community, you never expect this. We haven't, I know the US skipped 1980, the Soviets skipped 84, but there has not been a canceled Olympics since 1944. So here we are. And when you hear, well, actually, I want to backtrack because for people to know, you weren't just going to Tokyo for the Olympics. You told me you were going for a test event. I mean, what has your timeline been like with the Olympics in the last few months as coronavirus has spread around?
Yeah, Jeff, it's been a really strange experience. So you referenced those other Olympic games. You had the cancellations back in the 40s. You had the boycott in 1980, and then you have this postponement. So it's a whole other situation in that we know these Olympics will still happen, but now it's pushed back a year. And it's one of those things, you look at the calendar, and this was happening for all the sports in the U.S., but it was happening around the world as well. I think you initially hold out hope that you're going to be able to have certain things, and you move day by day, and then slowly things start getting knocked off the calendar. So one of the first things to go, you mentioned going to Tokyo. I was actually supposed to be there right now as we speak for an Olympic test event for water polo as they demo the stadium, and all that stuff happens across many sports. And that was one of the first things to go. And then in your mind, you're thinking at that point, okay, well, there'll be no test event, but there'll still be an Olympic Games. And then you're just looking at the things that are happening prior to the Olympics scheduled start. So basketball goes first, then baseball, things are getting pushed back. And then we saw the news come out. We lose track of days here, so it's hard to remember when it was, right? But we saw initially there was that talk about Olympic postponement from one IOC member, and then the very next day it comes out that that's exactly what's going to happen. And then it's finding out when will it be rescheduled. Now we know it's essentially going to be a full year pushback for Tokyo 2020. So it's been just following the news like everyone else, and everyone making the best decisions they can based off of health and safety, and then you just adjust off of that. But very, very odd, unprecedented circumstances for sure.
Yeah, the ever trustworthy Dick Pound was the IOC member who came out and said some things. But you being so tapped into the community, I mean, before this, I think before Americans realized what was going on with sports being canceled, when was the first time that you thought the Olympics might actually be canceled?
The Olympics,
postponed. I should make sure I say that.
And it's important to use that postponed language, right? Because it will still be played, but or contested. The Olympics obviously are not too big to fail, right? Or in this case, too big to get postponed. But I remember even talking about it in February, and maybe we were talking earlier in that month. And as this news started to bubble up, I kept thinking, well, that'll be one of the last things to go. So if other things are getting postponed, the Olympics would be the thing that they would try the hardest to try and keep going. And not because that's more important than any other important event, but because of the logistics that are involved with hosting Olympics. You could cancel 10 or postpone 10 Super Bowls much easier than you could the Olympic Games. There are just so many things working in concert together for that 3 weeks of competition. And so I thought they would wait and wait and wait. And then, the pressure I think just built, and the concerns, and then the realization that it was just going to be very difficult, not so much to even hold the games. We don't know what the end of July will look like right now, but it's all the lead up stuff. And that's really, I think, what differed from sport to sport as you look at getting ready for an Olympic Games. Some sports would be in an easier situation than others. And then you had the blanket effect where everyone was really struggling to train at the level they need to train at. As you saw facilities and things getting closed, it just kind of became a groundswell of there were too many things that weren't working to be able to properly prepare for something of this level.
Yeah, we're taping this on April 2nd. I mean, I read today Masahiro Tanaka is leaving the Yankees. He feels safer going to Japan than in the US. So people, I think, need to understand the state of Japan is different, or the optimism is different than necessarily the US or other countries right now. But to me, it was the global sort of, the same reason that was the justification that South by Southwest was, canceled before a lot of things in the US were canceled. It was this idea of people traveling from outside the country, from different walks of life coming together. And that's why I kind of looked around and I said, if the US isn't going to get back to life until, say, May or June. I know Toronto's closed public events through June 30th. It just didn't seem like you need the whole world to be right, it feels like, to have the Olympics. So I kind of started to recognize that. But you mentioned the Olympics not being, too big to fail. And I know there are a lot of sponsors that are signed on through 2020, and that's going to become a concern. What are some of the things that change in what we'll see from a 2020 to 2021 Olympics?
Well, there's a lot, and I'm far from a lawyer, right? But there's a lot of contract language. You're talking about sponsorship agreements, talking about broadcast rights. We know in the U.S. that NBC broadcast the Olympics domestically, but imagine in every other country that might show the Olympic Games, there are different broadcast agreements, and when do those run through, right? And I'm not sure how it works in other countries, right? But there might be ones, for example, that expired after these games. So how does that go? Does the person who already signed on for future Olympics get the new one? Do they get to keep the old one? Same for sponsor agreements. It was announced earlier this year, I want to say, that Delta was going to take over as the airline sponsor for Team USA after United. So just things like that, deals that were running just through these games. In the Olympic world, things very much work in what they call quadrennials, right? So you're talking about those 4-year periods, depending on if you're involved in winter or summer or both, where you build deals and schedules and calendars very regimented to those 4 years. And so when you get off of that schedule, it's a circumstance that nobody has ever thought of, but not many people are planning for, because you just always assume these things are going to happen. So you hear that force majeure phrase thrown around a lot, when you talk about acts that are just unpredictable, right? Or not one that can be blamed on any one person. And so there's just a lot, when you're talking about kind of the corporate world, of uncertainty about how things will go forward. I think what you've seen already, the first dominoes to fall are figuring out, well, when can we have these things, right? So now okay, it can't happen on these dates, so it's going to happen on these dates in the future, and then everyone else can get in line after that, right? If your big question is, when will the Olympics be? Your first answer is, well, now we know that, and then you can build off of that. And then it trickles down to the athletes and the teams and everything else, right? The other thing that came out was qualifications. If you've already qualified, that'll be honored, right? Which I was surprised that was up for debate, because it's still the same event. So why would your qualification not be valid? But that was answered. So there are just a lot of questions that were hanging in the balance. A few have been answered. Many, many more remain unresolved. And that's what people are going to try and figure out here going forward, how to reroute their planning for the next 12 months.
Well, that's for a couple of things you dropped there. Quadrennial is going to be a word that I'm going to put into my vernacular, first of all. So I'm taking that.
Oh, good. Please do.
It's going to feel, I feel like, a little pre-92-esque that we're going to have the Summer Olympics in July to August of 2021. And then we're going to go right into the Winter Olympics, roughly, I think, 6 months, right? 2022, will
Yeah,
be
maybe.
so it'll be so quick, and in the same continent. For certain people, they'll, they might as well not even leave. But then something that, you mentioned, the athletes being, if they've already qualified, it being honored. And I think, and you're so close to a lot of these athletes in so many Olympic sports, your window of opportunity is so small. And what does it mean for some of these athletes? I know Biles tweeted that she cried when she heard about the Olympics being moved, but it's the right thing to do. She already has some gold medals.
Sure.
She's going to be okay. But for so many of these athletes, it feels like, I'm sure they feel like they've been training and we're putting their bodies at the maximum point for 2020, and now they have to do it all again for 2021. How does that change things?
Yeah, that is that's a multifaceted kind of situation because first you have those that have qualified and those that haven't. So you take some team sports like water polo, for example, where both USA teams have already qualified. Then you look at something like USA swimming, where they had yet to have their trials. So those athletes were kind of gearing up for that moment to be able to race, to set the appropriate time. Same for track and field, whatever event they might be competing in. They were preparing to get into that ultimate mode to qualify and then go to the next competition. So now all of that gets pushed back a year. You have to figure out your training. You have to stay motivated and hungry, right, to do all of this again for 12 months. And then you bring up a great point. People, again, not to go back to this 4-year window, but people very much plan their lives around post-Olympic Games. So if you're a younger competitor, or someone that just plans to be in it for a long time, it maybe doesn't matter that it was pushed back a year, other than that you have to kind of continue the grind for another year, right? But you have so many people that after Olympic Games, they say, okay, well, once I get through this, now it's time to maybe go back to school. I'm going to start a family. I want to get a job. I want to do these other things. You talk about someone like Simone Biles, and one of our best athletes in the U.S., she's in a different financial situation, right, than a lot of other Olympic athletes, where they are scraping and clawing to stay and chase this dream. And now another year, it kind of puts on the back burner maybe other things that they wanted to do in life. And so what you'll see again next year as the Olympics are played is just, it's going to be a real testament to so many athletes, even the ones that you don't read about or don't get all the highlights, maybe don't win a single medal, but a real testament to those that wanted to stick it out and stay in this process and stay dedicated to their sport and their team through another year of training and dedication.
I mean, it feels like, right, Michael Phelps would retire after every Olympics. That was, the next year was a retirement year. Look, Kerry Walsh and Misty May would, Kerry Walsh Jennings and Misty May Trainer would plan their having children around the Olympic Games. I mean, they were able to navigate their pregnancy. I know Alex Morgan, right, said that she's pregnant right now. She was going to make this whole push to see if she could make the Olympic Games as quickly as possible. So now, whether you're someone like Alex Morgan that now is able to train a little more post your pregnancy to get into the Olympics, then you have others planning, family planning around the Olympics. It should be interesting in that regard. Is this a weird question? Tell me if it is. Would the IOC ever consider pushing the Olympics each back a year and going 2021, 2025, 2029, and even pushing the winter back a year?
My guess on that is no. I think that you want to take this one moment and try and correct the schedule as fast as possible, because again, it goes on to lots of legalese with contracts and that sort of thing. For example, I want to say NBC has the Olympics through 2032, but not 2033, right? So you start pushing years back and back and back. And then there's a whole bunch of other agreements that host cities have in place. One of the things that came up with Tokyo, right, was that the athlete village was going to be housing for the general public after the Olympic Games, right? So if you're saying we're going to build,
I hope so. People could assign leases for next year.
Very possible, and I don't know the details on that, right? But it's stuff like that, where building X is going to be where we're going to host judo during the Olympics, but it's going to turn into a school once the Olympics are over, and we've started enrollment. I'm just making this up, right? But we started enrollment for that. Those sorts of things would be why you want to try and stay on the schedule as much as possible. And that's why you'll see, because you talk about the Winter Olympics and Summer Olympics being so close together, that is an ideal for Winter Olympics when you're talking about the promotional aspects of Winter Olympians. You're now cutting in
It's
by a
now
whole
six
year.
months.
Yeah. So that whole hype machine that typically gets to generate prior to each Olympic Games, regardless of the country you're in, now that gets curtailed a bit because you have the Summer Olympics finishing, and now you immediately have to turn around. And how do you split your planning? Do you start to do a little winter planning before Tokyo? There's just a bunch of questions. And so I think you wouldn't see that at all. You might see that on some of the lesser non-Olympic competitions where, let's say, World Championships, aquatics World Championships, that's up for debate right now. That's supposed to be in Japan, in Fukuoka, next summer. That's on odd years, so 21, 23, 25. There's talks of when that will occur, right? Because again, you don't want to keep driving things back, or then your schedule remains up in the air for a while.
I mean, I guess in that case, you could do 2022 and 2023. I'm not the one making those plans. I don't. I enjoy the. It's easy for you to remember Summer Olympics, election year, and leap year all in the same year. So
Sure. Yes.
mentally, to not mentally drain us, I think that works. What have you seen from I don't know if it's committees, athletes, what have you seen? How have some of the, I guess, positive ways that people have reacted to this news and kind of said, all right, it is what it is. Here's this content that I'm putting out, or here's what I'm doing here. How have people reacted?
Well, I think from what I've heard from a lot of different athletes, whether summer, or whether they're Olympic veterans, Olympic hopefuls, they haven't been to a games. There's a common refrain of, something like different years, same dream, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the dream remains the same to be an Olympian, even if it's pushed back to 2021. And even if they were Olympian in the past, there's still that dream to do it again. So these are people by nature that are pretty positive and pretty resilient to compete at this level and to face some of the heartache and heartbreak that you do, whether it's coming up just short for a medal or just missing out on a team, trying to make that final roster or trying to make that final time in a trials. They're typically positive people to begin with. So I think you've seen a lot of that stuff. And then on another positive note, because everyone has a little bit more free time on their hands, they've had more time to, I think, engage with the community that supports them. So whether it's fans of track and field or swimming or gymnastics or whatever it might be, water polo, these people have been able to maybe interact, offer some of their expertise, try and get better engaged with the fans that support them and share some of their knowledge. So that's been kind of a happy side benefit of all of this, although they'd all love to be back training and competing as soon as possible. But I think by and large, everyone understands it's bigger than themselves. This is a worldwide issue. There isn't necessarily, it's tough in any one of these disappointing moments. There's not somebody to blame really. When you think about why an event like this gets postponed, there's not much they can do. So I think everyone has just kind of tried to be positive and share positive energy.
Yeah, I started to worry about the Olympics really when I saw that the US, I guess the USOC training center, the Team USA training centers.
Oh yeah, Colorado Springs.
Yeah, well, there's right there. I think there's 3: Colorado Springs,
There's
like
a couple. Colorado Springs,
Big Bear.
like some training in San Diego.
Yeah,
also.
yeah, or San Diego. So, but when I saw the one in Colorado shut its doors to anyone who wasn't a permanent resident, that's when I understand where it's like, okay, it's almost like a sleepaway camp. Everyone who's in here, if they don't have it, they're good. You start to worry about one person getting it and it's spreading among the entire team. And I'm sure other delegations have to deal with something, similar like that. For you personally, and aside from all this, you working so deep in the water polo world, what has struck you about those athletes just as you've covered them the last few years, as you've gotten to know them? Because they're the type of athletes that a lot of people in the public just pay attention to every 4 years, or maybe it's just world championships. What have you noticed about them as people and as athletes?
Again, it just really comes back to dedication, because as you alluded to, while it's a sport that's growing and gotten bigger and they get a bit more attention now than they did in the past, if you compare to an NBA or an NFL, right, they're still fairly anonymous with what they're doing. And so when you're doing something that is this challenging and requires this much time and dedication, you really have to admire some people that put really their careers, in some cases, some of their personal goals, some of their family goals on hold to pursue something like this. It, really is kind of that amateur athletic vibe that you hear about, at sports that don't get the the coverage level that some of the bigger sports get. And so, yeah, it just tends to be athletes that have tremendous work ethic, that are pretty humble. One of the interesting things about some of these quote unquote smaller sports is that a lot of these folks are very accessible. I always joke in the water polo community, where you can go to a masters competition, which is kind of the folks that have retired from, say, the high level competition, but still want to play, whether they're in their 30s or their 40s. And you can end up in a game against somebody who has multiple Olympic medals. Like, you're not ever going to the YMCA and going to end up accidentally guarding, Patrick Ewing. Like, it's just not happening, right? So that's one of the interesting things, is that it's a lot of these Olympic sports, they're small, tight-knit, close communities, people that really support each other. And in times like this, you do see them really band together and form an even tighter group and really try and support themselves. And they're just, in the end, just ultimately dedicated to their craft.
You mentioned the amateurism and the real feeling like amateur athletes. What is that? What is it like when, and what is the life like? I mean, these Team USA water polo players, are they relying, is it things like meals and access to gyms and things like that that's so reliant on actually being part of the team and not, taking money out of your own pocket? What is that lifestyle like?
It really varies from sport to sport, depending on the size of the sport. And then, of course, it's going to vary from country to country. But, the big thing in the U.S. is that, the Olympic sports in the United States are not a government-funded operation, which is the case in many, many other countries that are usually atop the leaderboard. We're talking about medals. For a water polo athlete, it is also a different experience for those that are post-college and currently in school. So some of them are in school, they're doing their usual school activities. Maybe they have scholarships of certain levels, and then they're training with the team, usually only on a full-time basis leading up to an Olympic Games. So in this time period now would be what you would call a residential training. And then you have athletes that are post-career, and they're making money in a variety of ways. Again, this is not something that's making anyone rich, right? These are not people that are getting wealthy off of this Olympic dream, but they're able to get support from the national governing body, from the U.S. Olympic Committee, and then they can add in maybe professional opportunities abroad. So they'll go over and play a short season or a tournament in Europe, maybe South America, Australia, that sort of thing, and then try and supplement their income other ways through maybe camps, clinics, that sort of thing. So that's, it is truly the hustle. They're doing all of this stuff to make it happen. They're getting certainly support. They're not typically having to pay their way at the water polo level. I can't speak to all other sports. I know there are other Olympic sports where athletes are trying to get to a point where they can get to that senior team, so they're maybe at a different rating level and trying to crack that top level, and they have to really invest in themselves. Not to say that athletes haven't done that here, but so it's a lot of things all kind of working together to again chase this dream. And it goes back to your other question about, when things get pushed back for a year or they have to delay things, right? It's another year of that dedication. I know one Olympic hopeful planning a wedding for the fall, right? It's like things like this that just you had thought you're in the clear. It's going to be post Olympic Games, and just the dedication continues. And certainly they get support. They would certainly love to get more. You'd hear that from every Olympic athlete, from the very top ones down to the sports that aren't as popular. But it really, again, comes down to folks that are just really dedicated and invested in chasing something bigger than themselves.
It sounds like a freelance lifestyle. A lot of it.
Something you might know a little bit about, right? You really know. You have to. It's different, right? In that you're not chasing multiple gigs at once. You know what your end goal is, and it's to be on that Olympic team, and then hopefully be on that Olympic podium. But to do the things to get there in those off years, in a non-Olympic year, it can be quieter. There are just certain months of the year when there's competition, and other times of the year there's more free time. So there's time to maybe get a part-time job, or try and go back to school and get some other education, or try and set something up for the future. So it's a challenge on a number of levels, and it's why really I know we both have great admiration for what Olympic athletes do in this country.
Definitely. I think, I think that's where I talk to so many people who say they're Olympic fans. Because one thing I want to leave the Olympic portion of this on this, because It's something that I think about sometimes, that there are so many, we call so many of these Olympic sports non-revenue sports, especially at the college level, because they're not as popular. People don't pay attention to what, some of the top, Katie Ledecky, for the most part, people are like, wow, she's such a beast every 4 years. But you're going on with life, and these Olympic athletes are going on in life. I mean, what are the state of Olympic sports in general? Because I do think there was some sort of glorified aspect for so many years that everyone would huddle around the TV, primetime, Bob Costas, NBC, every 4 years. It was such a big deal in that sort of way. And now, for better or for worse, things aren't on tape delay as much, and people are watching live, and there's not that community aspect of watching the Olympics. How do you feel about the state of Olympic sports in general right now?
Well, it's funny. Katie Ledecky is a beast every day, not just every 4 years.
I
Right?
understand that.
And that's the case across the board. There are so many other competitions that are going on year round. We talked about world championships. There are different meets. Every Olympic athlete can tell you about all these other things that are going on in their calendar. They all have at least 1, 2, 3, maybe more, depending on their sport, major competitions a year that keep them motivated, keep them sharp, keep them at that level that allows them to shine at the Olympic Games, right? If you were just waiting for that one moment every 4 years to compete, right, you probably wouldn't do that well. They need all this other competition, and also these other events are in many cases very big events, especially if you're invested in that sport. As far as the state of Olympic Games, you mentioned some of the broadcast coverage. If you follow NBC, NBCSN, Olympic Channel, they show a ton of content, live events, events on delay of those types of things that you might not see if you're watching just, for example, say an ESPN or a Fox Sports, that sort of thing. So they're really showing you some of those other competitions where these athletes are honing their craft. And then a lot of the national governing bodies put on their own broadcasts and share streams. And then a lot of the international governing bodies, if you think of like a FIFA, but for other sports, right? It's like a FINA in aquatics, a FIBA in basketball, that sort of thing, a FIBA or FIVA in volleyball, I think, have all these different competitions. So, it's, that's like very, very broad, I guess, to think about, right? Like the state of the Olympics in the U.S., college sports that are the Olympic sports that you were referencing, they get more coverage now than they ever did in the past, especially when you think about the regional sports networks and then college conference networks specifically. So ACC, SEC, Pac-12, Big Ten, all of them show a bunch of Olympic type sports. Pac-12, I think, shows close to 100 women's volleyball games a year. So there is exposure for these sports. Those are great training grounds. There's a program going around that started, I think, last year, Olympians Made Here, that kind of separates celebrates the connection between college campuses and developing Olympic athletes. And so colleges are a tremendous foundation for the growth of Olympic sports. And then, like I always say about water polo and every other Olympic sport, you can watch these things more than every 4 years. And I know the athletes and the people in those sports would love everyone to kind of check them out more often, because it's a lot of the same people that you love. They're still doing the things you love to watch every 4 years. They're just doing it on a more regular basis.
Well, I think, Usain Bolt versus Asafa Powell versus Tyson Gay versus Justin Gatlin could have been a primetime draw in the US 5 times a year. That's my opinion on that. Also, when I was in Seoul a couple months ago with the NBA 2K League, we were out at, World of Beer Seoul. For those people that have gone to World of Beers in other states, I should say, we were at World of Beer Seoul on a Saturday night, and on TV was volleyball, curling. I feel like there were a couple other Olympic type events, so I took note of that. It was like, look what the rest of the world is watching. I want to talk non-Olympics with you for a second. You were one of the last broadcasters still, I think, working on live sports in the U.S. before everything was shut down for coronavirus. What happened?
This was the end of the MAC basketball tournament down on the boardwalk in Atlantic City.
Two A's, MAC 2As.
Sorry, the MAC. So I have to remember, if you're unfamiliar, there's MACtion, right, the Mid America, and then on the East Coast there's the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference, or the MAC, as we say lovingly. That was their conference tournament, looking to crown obviously a men's and women's winner to go off to the NCAA tournament. And I want to say it was a Thursday morning. That was the day I believe it was maybe March 12th that everything kind of came to a pause. So the night before, March 11th, had called a great finish. St. Peter's defeating defending champion Iona on like a last-second shot. It was like the final game of the night. And we can touch on Iona in a moment if you'd
We
like.
will. We will.
So we have that game, and at halftime of that game, I talked with MAC Commissioner Rich Enser, and he says what a lot of conferences were saying. Going forward, we'll keep playing, but we'll only have essential people in the arena. There'll be no extra fans, that sort of stuff. So we get to the next day. And
were you essential?
I was deemed essential, apparently. Yeah. For like the first time in my life. Yeah. So we get in there, and it's a ghost town. We're ready to do the noon tip off. Now it's back to the women's bracket, and it was Fairfield and Siena, I believe. And we get through about halftime of that game. And again, you remember that day, just how much information was coming out minute by minute. So by halftime, it was like things were just getting canceled left and right. I think the night before they had taken the Big East off the court at halftime. And so we do that game, we get to halftime, and at halftime, I just look over Chris Williams, who I do the game with for a lot of the broadcasts at Manhattan, and just said, look, this is going to be it. I don't see how this continues on after this game. We started the second half, and then once that game was over, that was it. And I think it was just that game, and then there might have been two other games playing at the same time in the MEAC conference, and that was it. That was the end of college basketball for 2020, and just a surreal experience. You just walk out of that arena, and it's like, wow, we're done. And my joke afterwards, well, I've always wanted to call the last game of the season like Jim Nantz, but not like this. So.
I remember. Was that the Thursday or Friday of that week?
It was a Thursday. It was like a Thursday morning. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was spending a lot of time watching the Players Championship. Played one day of that tournament. Poor Hideki Matsuyama tied a course record, and then he'll never get to finish that. But that was the feeling that I started flipping around on ESPN2, like, what's still on? Is anything still happening? And you said the energy sucks. Guys are trying to fight, both men on the men's and women's side, where you were trying to fight for a spot in the NCAA tournament, and then all of a sudden that dream goes away right there. You mentioned Iona. Okay. What a ride it's been for New Rochelle in the last month, right? New Rochelle. And so I went to Mamaroneck High School, grew up in Larchmont, right? Literally one town over. And so New Rochelle becomes essentially the first epicenter of coronavirus in the U.S. And at the same time, Iona, which finishes playing basketball with you calling it, hires Rick Pitino as the head coach. You are, beyond the Olympics that you're deep in, that we just talked about. You're deep in the MAC conference. What is this? Why is Rick Pitino the head coach of Iona right now?
What a whirlwind a couple of days, it was for Iona, who has been one of the best teams in the Northeast. You just look at their record and winning percentage and that sort of thing going back over a decade, and they've just been highly successful. They had gone to the NCAA tournament 4 years in a row coming into this season under longtime coach Tim Cluse. He'd been out all season with an undisclosed medical issue, and so there was uncertainty about his return. He was still in touch with the team, and so there was a thought that maybe he would come back for next year. There was interim coaches in place, that sort of thing. And then very quickly, the season ends, all these postponements and cancellations happen. And then a few days later, Iona announces that Coach Cluse is stepping down, and now Rick Pitino is the new head coach. And that I remember being one of the first new pieces of sports news that came along in quite some time. It's certainly an interesting move. Coach Pitino had been, I want to say, in Greece for the last couple of years. I believe has some ties to leadership at Iona, and of course, got his start, I think, way back when at a small Catholic school, Providence, and then he was also with the Knicks, I believe. So, kind of a return to the Northeast in that regard. For a school like Iona to get a name like that is obviously headline news. You've already seen some news come across about recruits, some big recruits coming in because Iona was losing some key players. Also some talk about them getting some games at Madison Square Garden. So I think, and look, he's a polarizing figure. People certainly have their opinions about Rick Pitino based off of his career, how things ended at Louisville, all of that. You've certainly seen the news. But from a basketball standpoint, there's a lot of expectation there that he will elevate that program maybe beyond where it's been as of late, which is a high bar to reach in that conference when you've gone to the NCAA tournament 4 years in a row to now, and they've had some success. So now to do that and take it even higher and to raise that profile, I know it's going to be very interesting. I do the games for Manhattan. Iona is typically their main rival when you're talking about that conference. So it'll be very fascinating to see what happens next year when the two meet at least twice in the season, and maybe once again in the postseason, depending on how things go. But yeah, a lot more to kind of I guess unwind on that choice, and I'm sure a lot's going to be written about it. Right, there are folks that think that it's not a good idea, right, and based off of what's gone on and been reported that this person should not be coaching college athletes again. And then there are others who are excited about someone that has a long history of success in college basketball. So you have those two very different sides of the story kind of coming together now in New Rochelle.
Steve Masiello, as you mentioned, has had success at Manhattan. Another school in the MAC called Monmouth
Sure.
has had its fair share of success in, as you would know, in MAC action. So it's not unprecedented that this conference can put something together. I'm interested to see if we see some nationally televised Iona games, just kind of like your Tuesday night. Especially if Iona's playing any big during non-conference play, any big conference team, I think we're going to see a lot of Rick Pitino on TV. Before I let you go, obviously we're going through a difficult time right now, and everyone's sheltering in place around the country. I like to call you bi-coastal. Sometimes you're in San Francisco, sometimes you're in New York, New Jersey. I never know. What have you been doing during this time? What are some things and some advice you could give people to help them pass the time?
It's interesting doing a lot of social media interviews and that sort of thing with the water polo community. Do a lot of broadcasts throughout the year, and with there not being any games to call, kind of pivoting to lots of Instagram lives, that sort of thing, and talking to a lot of folks that have better expertise than myself in kind of what you're talking about, right? How to get through some of these moments, and what a lot of people have talked about. Again, it sounds very simple, but it's very essential. It's things you've time and time again about building a routine, staying positive, staying in touch with others, right? Just because we're supposed to be socially distant, right? Really, which means physically distant from each other, doesn't really mean we have to be socially distant. We're talking about calling friends and family, connecting with people, sending people emails, that sort of stuff. So I think the things that have been reiterated, right, is wherever you are, whatever your situation is, try to develop a routine, because each little step of your routine will give you a sense of accomplishment throughout the day. Even if you can't or don't have the time to do much. I mean, everyone is in a very different circumstance, whether you still have to work and you're uncertain about that, or you're stuck at home, or you have kids and you're doing home education, or you are a student and you're doing your distance learning. It runs the gamut, right? So there's not a one size fits all for everybody, but if you can attempt to start each day with some positive energy by doing something good for yourself, whether it's some exercise, trying to eat healthy, eat a balanced meal. You can tell I'm talking to a lot of Olympians here, right? But these are the things they're stressing. This is what's worked well for them. And I think, those things are important. Don't forget to reach out to others. And the more that you can get yourself in a routine and try and develop what your plan of action is for each day, I think that's helpful. And then two, so many of us are homebound, right? This is that self-quarantine. You have to change up your locations. Someone I talked to this week said, treat your house almost as if you're on a trip about town, right? So, hey, now I'm going to move over to the kitchen. Now I'm going to be over here in the dining room, right? It sounds silly, but don't keep everything in the same area. So don't wake up, pick up your computer, lay in bed, do all your work right there, stay there, do your FaceTime call, and now it's noon and you haven't showered, right? It's like, try and move around, make different parts of your home, whatever it is, if it's a studio apartment or it's a much bigger home, try and make different areas for different things so you're not falling into just that state of being stuck quite literally in one spot. And that sort of thing has really helped. And then, like anything, right? If you're having a tough time, reach out to somebody that you rely on or care about, and tell them how you're feeling, ask them how they're doing, that sort of stuff, especially now in a time of physical distance. Social connection is more important than ever.
Greg, your advice is always appreciated. I should also mention, I love to tell you about this. I mean, when I went freelance, I was a lost. I wasn't sure where I was going with things, and you were the first person that reached out and bought me lunch. So I'll always, and you kind of said, calm down. You know, I've been in this business a long time. Here's some advice, and I will forever appreciate that.
Hey man, happy to do it, and glad to see all the great things you're doing. And as I always tell you, when you're running this whole operation, don't forget about me. So,
thank you so much. Appreciate the time. Appreciate all the insight, Greg.
All right, take care, Jeff. Talk soon.
That was my buddy Greg Mescall. No Olympics in 2020, but hopefully you got some Olympic fill, and you could follow him at Greg Mescall, GregMescall. You can follow me at Jeff Eisenband on all forms of social media, JEFFEISENBAND. If you have ideas for this podcast or you want to sponsor this podcast, just holler. Let me know. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Eyes on the Prize.